Welcome, bedtime's sleepy historian. Tonight, we step into a monastery where the walls hum softly with centuries of prayer, and the air smells faintly of wet stone and beeswax candles. Here lives a monk with a strange devotion, not to scripture alone, but to the sky itself. For decades, he has been listening to rain. Not just hearing it, but learning its accents, its moods, its secret names. In brittle parchment scrolls, he records every drizzle and downpour, each one as if it were a rare and vanishing bird. This is the tale of the monk who catalogued every kind of rain, a story of patience, obsession, and the quiet beauty of noticing what the rest of the world hurries past. Now, settle in. The clouds are gathering, and the first drops are about to fall. The first drop. Brother Anselm awoke to the sound of rain. It was not yet the ringing of the dawn bell, nor the rustle of sandals in the cloister hall. Only that soft, deliberate tapping against the shutters of his cell. He lay still for a moment, letting his mind find the rhythm. This one was new. It had the polite, hesitant quality of a guest unsure if they had knocked too late in the evening. A spring rain, perhaps, but not quite the kind that fell on gardens. He rose slowly, pulling the woolen robe over his shoulders. The flagstones were cold beneath his bare feet as he crossed to the narrow window's slit. A line of light gray sky pressed low over the abbey fields, and the air shimmered faintly, as if mist and drizzle had decided to hold hands. The drops left little pocks in the rain barrel by the herb garden, round, shallow ones that did not linger long before vanishing into the next. Anselm fetched a small bundle of vellum from his desk. The pages were already stained with years of weather, watermarks that had faded into pale ghosts of storms past. Each sheet carried its own heading. Of rains in the month of Martius. Of the falling of silver threads in late harvest. Beneath the headings, his notes marched in neat lines, written in ink he mixed himself from walnut husks. He dipped his quill and began to write. On the morning of St. Benedict's feast, before the ringing of prime, a rain came that was like the breath of a sleeping child, light, untroubled, but persistent enough to wet the earth without burdening it. It gave off the scent of warmed stone and green nettles. The abbey had its share of oddities, a brother who carved chess pieces from marrow bones, another who claimed to understand the moods of bees, but none puzzled the others quite as much as Anselm's devotion to the rain. Some thought it a harmless eccentricity. Others whispered it was a kind of private heresy, a love too keen for something that came and went without blessing. But for Anselm, each drop was a syllable in a language the sky had been speaking since the first dawn. And he intended, before his own dusk, to write its dictionary. The abbey's whispered curiosity. Brother Anselm's habit of slipping out into the cloister gardens at odd hours had not gone unnoticed. The younger novices, always eager for a distraction from copying psalms, would peek through the arches to watch him tilt his head toward the clouds like a hound catching scent. Sometimes he would stand for only a moment, then hurry back inside to scribble notes. Other times, he lingered for hours in the rain itself, water trickling from his hood, as though it were not dampness at all but some rare incense he could not bear to waste. In the refectory, over bowls of steaming barley porridge, the brothers would murmur. "Perhaps the rain speaks to him," Brother Matthias said one morning, half in jest, half in envy. "If it does," Brother Odo replied, "then it says more than it does to us. I only hear it telling me to stay inside." The abbot, an aging man with eyes like worn copper coins, never forbade Anselm's work. He would simply glance up from his reading when the monk padded past in wet sandals, and say, "Do not let the rain wash away the hours, brother." Anselm would bow and keep walking. He knew his duty to prayer, to labor, to silence. But there was another duty, one unspoken, to notice what the world ignored. On the day the autumn storms began, he brought out his largest parchment sheet yet, a map of the surrounding hills, rivers, and valleys inked with meticulous care. At each place he had marked the character of the rain he had found there, the fast needles over the eastern ridge, the warm mists in the river meadows, the great drumming storms that rolled down from the northern woods. It was not only a catalogue of weather, he realized. It was a map of moods, of the land's very soul. And yet, he had only just begun. The Pilgrim and the Storm. It was on a wind-tossed evening in late November that the abbey received a pilgrim. The bell above the gate clanged 3 times, struggling against the gale, and Brother Anselm, on his way to the scriptorium, paused to watch the porter usher in a cloaked figure dripping from head to boot. The man's beard was tangled with leaves, and his cloak smelled sharply of wood smoke and wet wool. Yet his eyes, dark and steady, took in the courtyard with a calm that seemed at odds with the tempest raging above. The brothers hurried him toward the warmth of the refectory, but Anselm lingered under the eaves, face turned upward. The rain tonight was a thing alive, heavy, full-bellied drops that slapped the stone like thrown seeds. It came in bursts, then sudden pauses, as though gathering breath before flinging itself down again. Lightning stitched ragged seams across the horizon. A merchant storm, Anselm murmured into the darkness, pen already in hand. He wrote on the back of his palm when no parchment was near, ink smudging as it met the water. Carries its wares in a hurry, spends them all at once, leaves the market square flooded. Later, by the hearth, the pilgrim asked him quietly, "You watch the rain as one watches a friend's face?" Anselm glanced up from his bowl. Most people saw his work as odd, unnecessary. This man's tone carried no mockery. "And you listen to it?" Anselm asked. "Always," the pilgrim replied. "It tells me when to travel, and when to wait." The 2 men exchanged no more words that night, but something about the meeting, like the smell of rain on dry soil, lingered in Anselm's thoughts. For the first time, he wondered if his catalogue might be of use to someone beyond these cloistered walls. The abbot's caution. The next morning dawned pale and wet, the storm having left behind a sky rubbed thin as parchment. Brother Anselm found the abbot in the library, sorting through a stack of worm-eaten manuscripts that smelled faintly of mildew and lavender oil. "Brother," the abbot said without looking up, "you were out late again last night." Anselm inclined his head. "The storm was unlike any I have yet recorded." The abbot sighed and placed a brittle folio on the table with care. "I do not begrudge you your observations. But storms can be dangerous companions. They drown crops, flood villages, and tempt men to linger in places they should not. And yet," Anselm replied softly, "they also feed the rivers, fill the cisterns, and wash the dust from the air. They are not one thing alone." For a moment, the abbot studied him. His gaze was not unkind, but it carried the weight of one who had watched many young passions burn out against the stone walls of discipline. "I only ask," the abbot said finally, "that you remember your vows are to God first, and the rain only after." Anselm bowed in obedience, but as he left, he thought of the pilgrim's words. If the rain spoke to travelers, if it warned them when to wait and when to move, perhaps his catalogue could serve as a scripture of the sky, a way for men to walk more safely in the world. That evening, as vespers faded into silence, he returned to his map. He began adding not only the character of each rain, but the counsel it might offer. River mist, safe for journeying; road hail, shelter until morning; merchant storm, delay travel 3 days. In his neat, deliberate script, the language of the rain was slowly becoming a guide. The winter drizzle. December brought a hush over the hills. Snow rarely came to this part of the valley, but the cold shaped the rain into quieter forms, thin, silvery threads that drifted sideways on the wind, landing without sound on the cloister roof. Brother Anselm loved this season. The drizzle had a humility to it, as though it knew it was not the centerpiece of the day, only the background to a monk's steady labor. He would sit in the garden cloister beneath the arches, quill in hand, watching how the droplets gathered on the bare vines, trembling before slipping free. "This one," he wrote, "is the rain of patience. It carries no urgency. It asks nothing of the earth except a moment's welcome." The other brothers hurried through the cold, heads down, shoulders hunched against the damp. Anselm let it settle on his robe until the wool was heavy, the scent of wet lanolin rising faintly. One afternoon, the pilgrim from the storm returned, not to stay, but passing through on his way north. His boots were caked in pale clay, and his cheeks glowed with wind. "You keep your vigil still," the man said, glancing at the vellum in Anselm's lap. "The rain keeps its vigil over me," Anselm replied. The pilgrim laughed softly, then leaned in. "In the mountains there is a kind of rain that falls in two directions at once. It feeds the grass on one slope and floods the stones on the other. If you wish to complete your catalogue, you will need to see such things." That night, as the drizzle tapped gently against his shutters, Anselm lay awake wondering, was his task to record the rains here, or to follow them wherever they fell? The decision to leave. By the feast of St. Hilary, the thought had taken root. Brother Anselm sat in the scriptorium one cold morning, the air thick with the smell of ink and burning peat. Around him, the other monks bent over their work, copying gospels or binding worn volumes with careful stitches. His own hands, though, hesitated above the page. The drizzle outside was whispering. He could hear it in the courtyard fountain, a soft patter that told him this was no ordinary winter rain. He knew its name already. He had written about it last year. A rain like this carries tidings from far places. For the first time, he wondered if the rain itself was calling him away. The pilgrim's words returned to him. "In the mountains there is a kind of rain that falls in two directions at once." Anselm imagined the slopes, the air thin and clean, the strange double falling water marking two paths. It was the kind of phenomenon that would never come to the abbey's valley. That evening, he sought the abbot's counsel. "I wish to travel," he said simply. The abbot's brow furrowed, but he did not seem surprised. "To see the rains you cannot meet here?" "Yes, Father. To make the catalogue whole." For a long moment, the old man said nothing. Then he reached into a drawer and brought out a small brass compass, the kind pilgrims sometimes carried. "If you go, go as one who listens, not only to the sky, but to the ground beneath it. And return, Brother Anselm. The abbey's stones will keep your echoes until you do." That night, as wind rattled the shutters, Anselm packed his vellum, his quills, and the compass. The rain outside seemed almost eager on the roof, as if urging him toward the road. The road beyond the hills. Brother Anselm left the abbey at dawn, the gate creaking behind him like an old friend reluctant to say goodbye. The winter light was thin and pearly, spilling over the frost-silvered fields. His sandals pressed faint crunches into the dirt path, the sound muffled by a low, steady rain that had followed him out of the cloister like a companion unwilling to part. He walked with his hood drawn forward, not to shield himself from the wet, but to hear it better, the rain on the leather of his satchel, the rain on bare hedgerows, the rain on the crown of his own head. Each surface gave it a different timbre, like the varying notes of a psalter. Past the last familiar farmstead, he entered a stand of beeches whose bark gleamed pale as bone. Here the rain grew softer, each drop breaking into a silver mist before touching the ground. He paused, opened his journal beneath the shelter of a leaning trunk, and wrote, "Beech rain falls with humility, not as droplets but as breath. Conceals its arrival until the forest is already wet." By midday, the path began to climb. The low valley mist thinned, and the air sharpened in his lungs. The rain changed too, longer falls, more space between drops, as though the sky were conserving its stores for the heights. At a bend in the trail, Anselm met a shepherd huddled under a felted cloak, his sheep clustered like grey stones around him. The man squinted at the monk. "Road steep ahead. Best wait for the sky to decide if it's friend or foe today." Anselm glanced upward, smiling faintly. "It hasn't lied to me yet." The shepherd chuckled, shaking his head. "Then you listen better than most." And so Anselm pressed on, each step carrying him deeper into rains no abbey wall had ever heard. The rain of two directions. By the third day, the path wound into the high passes, where the air was cold enough to sting the nose and the wind moved like unseen herds across the ridges. Snow lay in shallow pockets along the shaded slopes, but above them, a sky the color of tarnished silver hung low. It was here, near a saddle between two peaks, that Anselm first felt it. The rain began without warning, fine, needle-like drops that seemed to blow eastward. He turned his face into it, listening, measuring the cadence. But then, faintly, he heard another rhythm entirely, slower, heavier drops behind him, moving westward. He stepped into the open and saw it clearly. Two curtains of rain drifting past one another, each keeping to its own course, as if the sky had been split by an invisible wall. One side slanted toward the valley he had just left, the other marched toward the distant river basin. Anselm's heart beat faster. He fumbled for his vellum, but his hands shook with cold and awe-like. "Rain of two directions," he wrote, ink blotting in the wet. "It speaks in counterpoint. One voice calls for retreat, the other urges onward. Together, they tell of choice and consequence." The wind shifted, mingling the two rains for a moment into a soft, swirling mist. He thought of the abbot's compass in his pouch, and of the pilgrim who had first told him of this marvel. Standing there on the ridge, wet through to the bone, Anselm felt as though he were reading from a page the world had written only once, and only for those willing to walk far enough to see it. When the rains faded, he pressed the page carefully between two dry sheets, as one might preserve a rare flower. The village by the river bend. Descending from the ridge, Brother Anselm followed a trail that wound through pine forests and opened suddenly onto a wide, looping bend in a pale green river. A small village clung to the shore, stone cottages with mossy thatch, their chimneys releasing ribbons of smoke that the wind teased apart. The rain here was different again. It fell in intermittent bursts, as if drawn from a bucket in the sky and poured without warning. Each outpouring splashed the hard-packed dirt into temporary pools, which the children delighted in stomping through. Anselm lingered in the square, watching how the drops struck the river and spread outward in overlapping circles, each collision making the surface shiver. He jotted, "Bucket rain, impatient, without ceremony. Often follows mountain winds and leaves quickly, like a guest who eats in haste and departs before the table is cleared." In the evening, the village elder, a stooped woman with a voice like gravel, invited him to her hearth. Over bowls of fish stew, she told him the river's floods were foretold not by clouds, but by a peculiar kind of rain that seemed to climb back into the air after falling. "It dances," she said, tapping the side of her bowl. "That's when you know to tie the boats high and move the goats uphill." Anselm's quill scratched eagerly over the parchment. Here was a new species of rain entirely, one he had never imagined. That night, lying on a pallet in the elder's loft, he could hear the river moving in the dark, its current murmuring under the light patter outside. The sound wove itself into his dreams, pulling him onward toward the rains yet unnamed. The dancing rain. Morning broke under a heavy, low sky. The elder's warning proved true. By mid-morning, the air felt strange, charged with a dampness that clung to the skin. Anselm stepped outside just as the first drops fell. At first, it seemed like any light rain. But then he noticed, the drops struck the hard earth and leapt back upward in tiny beads, scattering into the air before falling again. It was as if the ground refused to accept them at once, insisting they perform before being welcomed. The children of the village ran out laughing, holding flat boards and upturned pans to see the beads bounce and roll. Even the elder, leaning on her stick, watched with a faint smile. Anselm crouched low, his robe soaking at the hem, and studied the movement. He had seen rains that rolled, rains that slid, rains that vanished into the soil without a trace, but never one that danced. Dancing rain, he wrote in his neat hand, the ink smudging from stray droplets. Falls with an unspent energy, rebounding from earth to air as though caught between two desires. Best met with joy and open hands. When it ended, the ground seemed drier than it had any right to be, the water having spent more time in the air than in the soil. The elder pressed a small loaf of dark bread into his hands before he left. "You'll find other strange rains upriver," she said. "Some worth walking in. Some not." Anselm thanked her and set off along the river's winding path, the memory of the rain's playful leaps still bright in his mind. For the first time since leaving the abbey, he began to wonder whether his catalogue was not only a work of record, but of preservation, a way to keep alive the spirit of each rain long after it passed. The rain that sang against stone. Several days upriver, the banks narrowed into a gorge where the water rushed between walls of dark granite. Moss clung to every crack, and the air smelled faintly of iron. Anselm camped near a natural arch where the river's roar softened into a low, steady hum. The rain came without ceremony, small, quick drops pattering onto the cliff faces. But the sound they made was unlike any he had heard before. Each stone, depending on its size and shape, produced a different pitch. Together they wove a melody that seemed both ancient and improvised, echoing faintly in the gorge. Anselm stood still, eyes closed, letting the tones find him. High, bright notes from the thinner slabs. Deep, resonant hums from the larger boulders. The rain itself became a choir, and the gorge its cathedral. "Stone song rain," he recorded with care. "Its voice is born not of the sky alone, but of the earth it meets. Best heard in narrow places where sound cannot escape too quickly." That evening, he shared his fire with a pair of charcoal burners traveling downriver. They told him that in the spring thaw, when the snowmelt swelled the gorge, the stone song rain grew so loud it could be heard in the next valley. Some claimed it brought luck to those who listened without speaking until the last note faded. Anselm kept the tradition, sitting alone after they left, silent until the last patter died away. In that stillness, he felt certain that the rain's music was not made for him alone, but he was glad, deeply glad, to be among the few who had listened. The rain that never touched the ground. 2 weeks later, Anselm followed the river into low, open plains where the horizon stretched unbroken in all directions. The air here was dry despite the season, and the sun carried a thin, cold glare that made him squint. He first noticed it one afternoon when the sky turned the color of pewter. A curtain of rain hung in the distance, sweeping across the fields like a gray veil. But as he walked toward it, he realized something strange. None of it was reaching the earth. The drops fell from the clouds and then, just above the ground, seemed to vanish into nothing, evaporated by the dry wind before they could land. The scent of rain was there, sharp, clean, like the abbey courtyard after scrubbing, but the soil remained untouched, thirsty. "Vanishing rain," Anselm wrote, shielding his parchment from the wind. "Falls with promise, delivers none. Leaves only its perfume as proof of its passing. Both a mercy and a sorrow." A farmer in the plains told him this kind of rain was called the tease, for it fooled the fields into thinking relief had come. Crops would lift their leaves, only to find no drink at all. That night, Anselm sat under a lone acacia tree, watching the distant vales sweep back and forth, never touching the ground. It made him think of words spoken but never heard, prayers carried away before reaching the altar. He wondered, should a rain that never lands still belong in his catalogue? The answer came quietly, as answers often did, yes. For not all things worth noting must be things that stay. Some are worth remembering precisely because they pass without leaving a trace. The midnight downpour. The plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with wind-bent oaks and scattered stone chapels long abandoned. Anselm traveled slowly, following faint cart tracks, until one night he found shelter in the remains of a roofless cloister. The stars were sharp and bright overhead when he lay down. But sometime past midnight a sound woke him, a deep, steady drumming. Rain. He sat up to find the sky split wide open, pouring with such force that each drop stung where it struck. The ground turned to rivulets in minutes, water swirling through the cloister's cracked tiles. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that seemed to rise from the rain itself, as though it had been heated in the clouds. Anselm pulled his robe close and stepped into the open court. The downpour had a weight, a density, that left no space for breath between drops. It was a baptism by deluge. Midnight downpour, he wrote later in the lee of a wall. Arrives without warning, as if the sky has been holding its breath too long and must release it all at once. Brings with it a heat that is both cleansing and oppressive. By morning, the rain had vanished, leaving only the cloister's stone gleaming under a pale sun. The air smelled of wet lime and moss. Anselm found himself oddly renewed, as though the night had washed away more than dust from his journey. The memory of the abbey's quiet cloisters came to him, not as a longing, but as a reminder that even the stillest places once knew storms. He pressed on, eager to meet the next voice in the sky's great language. The rain that carried dust. By late spring, Brother Anselm had reached the edge of a great plateau. The air was warmer here, and the wind moved in restless spirals, tugging at his hood and carrying with it a faint, dry scent. The rain came in the afternoon, borne on a wind that turned the sky the color of tarnished brass. At first the drops seemed ordinary, warm, heavy, and slow. But when one struck his cheek, he felt the grit. Looking down, he saw that each drop left a faint ochre smear where it landed, as though it had carried a pinch of the plateau's dust with it. The effect was strange. The rain darkened the ground not just with wetness but with color, tinting the stone and leaves in pale red. The sheep in a nearby pasture shook their coats in irritation, little clouds of tinted mist rising from their wool. Dust-bearing rain, Anselm recorded. Falls as though it has traveled far and brought the memory of another land in its skin. Colors the world briefly, then washes itself away. That evening, he shared bread with a goatherd who told him the dust came from desert's many days' walk to the south. It rides the wind, joins the clouds, and falls where it will, the man said. A traveler's rain. Never born where it lands. Anselm liked that thought, that the rain could be a wanderer too, carrying stories across distances, changing the places it touched before moving on. In the fading light, the plateau glowed faintly red, as if the day itself had been steeped in another country's memory. The rain with no sound. Days later, while crossing a high meadow scattered with alpine flowers, Anselm encountered a weather unlike any he had known. The sky clouded over in a soft gray, but the wind did not rise. There was no smell of rain beforehand, no sharpness, no earthy stirring. And then it began. The drops were so fine they could hardly be seen, no larger than breath caught in cold air. They fell straight down, untouched by wind, and when they landed on grass or stone, they made no sound at all. Not a patter, not a hiss, only the faintest darkening where they touched. It was as if the rain did not wish to announce itself. Anselm stopped walking, suddenly aware of how loud his own footsteps felt. He set down his satchel and stood still, letting the silent rain gather on his eyelashes, his hair, the folds of his robe. It felt like the sky was speaking, but in a language without words. Silent rain, he wrote with deliberate care. Requires stillness to notice. Arrives without warning and departs without farewell. A gift for those who do not demand to be entertained. When the clouds thinned, the meadow looked unchanged. No puddles, no rivulets, yet his robe was heavy, and the flowers bowed under invisible weight. As he descended toward the next valley, Anselm found himself glancing back at the meadow. He knew that rain would be difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't stood in it themselves. And perhaps that was the point. The rain that fell upward. It happened on a day of restless wind. Anselm had been following a narrow mountain road carved into the side of a gorge when he felt a sudden tug at his robe, not from ahead or behind, but from below. He stopped, gripping the stone parapet, and looked down. Far below, the river churned between black rocks. Spray leapt high where the current struck the walls, carried upward by the wind in glittering arcs. But this was more than spray. Thin curtains of water seemed to climb the cliff face, shivering as they rose, before breaking apart into drifting mist above his head. For a moment, Anselm laughed aloud, startling a raven from a nearby ledge. "Rain that climbs," he murmured. "Rain that refuses gravity." He leaned out carefully, letting the upward falling drops wet his face. They were warmer than he expected, born from the sun-warmed river far below, carried aloft by wind funneled through the gorge. "Upward rain," he wrote later while sitting on a boulder, "does not descend from the heavens but rises from the earth in defiance. Best met where the wind has the strength to reverse the order of things." A passing trader on a mule stopped to watch him scribbling. "That's the river giving back what it borrowed," the man said. "It never forgets the sky, even when it's trapped in the deep." Anselm liked that thought. Rain, he realized, was not always about falling, it was about returning. And returns could happen in any direction. The rain that waited. Anselm reached a fertile valley dotted with orchards in bloom, their blossoms pale as milk against the green slopes. The air was heavy with the scent of apple and pear, but above, the clouds hung thick and dark, promising rain that stubbornly refused to fall. For 3 days the sky held its burden. Farmers glanced upward while pruning branches, murmuring that the rain was thinking. Children skipped stones on the pond without fear of sudden showers. Anselm felt the weight of it too. The air was so saturated that every breath seemed a sip of water. He carried his vellum and quill wherever he went, ready to write the moment the first drop came. When it finally did, it was almost shy, a single bead striking his wrist as he sat beneath an apple tree. Then another on the back of his neck. And then, as if a signal had been given, the clouds released themselves in a slow, steady fall. "Waiting rain," he wrote beneath the shelter of his cloak. "Holds itself in the sky long past the moment of readiness. Falls as if savoring its own decision to begin. Teaches patience to those who notice its reluctance." A farmer told him this kind of rain was the most treasured. "It seeps in deep," she said, "because the earth has been thirsty for so long." That night, lying in a loft above the stable, Anselm thought about the waiting rains of life, the moments that test endurance, then finally, quietly, arrive. The rain that spoke in echoes. The road led Anselm into a limestone canyon where every sound seemed to return in softened imitation. The clink of his staff, the rustle of his robe, even the quiet clearing of his throat, all were thrown back to him from unseen walls. It was there, in the muted half-light of the gorge, that the rain began. At first, it was gentle, a fine mist slipping between the cliff faces. But then came a steadier fall, each drop striking stone, water, and leaf with a sound that multiplied. When a drop landed on the brim of Anselm's hood, he heard not one patter, but a dozen faint repetitions fading into the rock. The rain seemed to speak in echoes, every note accompanied by ghost notes, as though the valley itself were murmuring back. He removed his hood, closed his eyes, and listened. The echoes weren't identical. They bent and blurred, some lower, some sharper, some strangely like a sigh. Echo rain, he wrote when he found shelter beneath an overhang. Each drop lives many lives, bouncing into the air, off stone, into memory. The sound of one thing becoming many, and many returning to one. A shepherd passing by with 2 goats nodded at his words. The cliffs remember everything, she said. Even the rain. That's why it never sounds lonely here. Anselm lingered, letting the sound weave through him. This rain was more than water. It was conversation. The rain that fell sideways. Anselm left the canyon for the high coastal road, where the sea stretched vast and silver under a restless sky. The wind here had a mind of its own, never content to push in a single direction. It curled and snapped, carrying salt and gull cries in its teeth. The rain began with no ceremony, flung in ragged sheets that didn't bother to fall straight. It drove sideways across the road, needling into his cloak from the east one moment, from behind the next. The drops stung, not from their weight, but from the force with which the wind flung them. Anselm angled his hood low, squinting against the gusts, and found himself laughing despite the chill. The rain's path was impossible to predict. It didn't descend, it charged. Under the meager shelter of a tilted pine, he wrote. Sideways rain moves with the will of the wind, not gravity. Seems intent on arriving everywhere it shouldn't, under eaves, into sleeves, across hearth fires. A mischievous rain, loyal to no path. A fisherman he met at the cliff's edge told him that this kind of rain was beloved by sailors. It reminds you the world isn't tame, the man said, spitting over the edge into the foam. Anselm thought on that as he continued along the cliff, the sideways rain chasing him like a playful hound. The rain that waited. In the final stretch of his journey, Anselm reached a meadow hemmed in by low, dark hills. The air was heavy, so thick with moisture it seemed he could scoop it with his hands. The grass bowed under invisible weight, and every bird in the hedgerows was silent, as though holding its breath. This was not yet rain. This was the pause before. Anselm stopped walking. The wind had gone utterly still. His cloak hung limp. The sky above was a smooth lid of gray, with a faint bruise of violet where the sun hid. The world seemed suspended, unmoving, unreal. Minutes passed. A single drop landed on the back of his hand. Then nothing. Another long wait. Then 2 drops, then 5. Then, without warning, the sky let go. The first proper fall was warm, almost summer-like, and he could feel the earth drink it in eagerly. Waiting rain, he wrote, sitting cross-legged in the wet meadow. Not the storm itself, but the moment when the world stands between 2 breaths. When every living thing tilts its head upward, sensing the inevitable. By the time he reached the far end of the meadow, the rain had eased. The grass shimmered, the air was sweet, and Anselm knew his catalogue was nearly complete. Tomorrow, he would return to the monastery. And yet, a quiet part of him wondered, if he went on walking forever, would the rain keep inventing itself anew? The monastery's shelves. When Anselm finally stepped through the monastery gates, the other monks greeted him with polite curiosity, as if welcoming a man returned from a long but ordinary errand. Only Brother Matthew seemed to grasp the depth of what he carried. They cleared a long oak table in the scriptorium, and Anselm laid out his journals, 20 volumes, each bound in worn leather, each page smelling faintly of the rain it described. One by one, he read aloud the names he had given: ash rain, candle rain, rain that fell sideways, waiting rain, and all the others, each accompanied by his careful notes, his sketches of clouds, his pressed leaves still bearing droplets turned to faint stains. The abbot listened in silence, his hands folded, his eyes half closed. When Anselm finished, the old man said only, "The Lord made rain, and you have made its memory." The catalogue was placed on the highest shelf of the monastery library, where the sun struck it in the mornings. It was not read often, few had the patience to savor each page. But those who did swore that, as they turned the leaves, they could hear the patter, hiss, or roar of the very rain described, and sometimes, if they leaned close, they caught the scent of distant storms. As for Anselm, he did not stop noticing rain. He could not. On quiet days, when a drizzle slicked the monastery's stones, he would stand at the cloister's edge, eyes closed, counting the drops, not to add to his catalogue, but simply to greet an old friend. The rain that could not be named. Years later, when Anselm's beard had gone white and his hands trembled too much to hold a quill, he awoke one dawn to an unfamiliar sound. It was rain, yes, but not like any he had known. It was neither soft nor fierce, either joyous nor mournful. It seemed to fall both nearby and far away, as though the sky itself were remembering something. He rose, leaning on his staff, and made his way to the cloister. The other monks still slept. The rain struck the flagstones in a pattern that felt like language, a whisper he could almost understand, but not quite. It made him ache, not with sorrow, but with the knowledge that some things are meant to remain unnamed. He smiled at that thought. His catalogue had been his life's work, yet here, at the end, was proof that the rain was larger than any list. Anselm sat on the wet bench, letting the drops gather in the folds of his robe. He closed his eyes, listening until the sound became everything, the bells, the wind, his own heartbeat. When Brother Matthew found him hours later, the rain had stopped, and Anselm was gone. On the bench beside him lay his final blank page, untouched except for 3 words written in an unsteady hand. "Let it fall." The monks buried Anselm in the small graveyard behind the orchard, where the earth was soft and moss crept over the stones. It rained the day they laid him to rest, just enough to bead on the petals of the apple blossoms and darken the folds of their robes. Brother Matthew noticed it was unlike any he had felt before, warm as a blessing, cool as a sigh. When the service was done, Matthew slipped away to the scriptorium. He opened the final volume of Anselm's catalogue, the one left unfinished. The blank pages seemed to hum with possibility. He dipped a quill in ink, hesitated, then closed the book without writing a word. Instead, he stood by the window and listened to the rain. Somewhere, Anselm was listening too, perhaps cataloguing still, perhaps simply letting it fall. Years later, travelers passing through the monastery would sometimes find Matthew in the cloister during storms, his head tilted to the sky, a faint smile on his lips. When asked what kind of rain it was, he would answer, "The kind my friend would have loved,